Today, I want to talk about something I have been watching happen for years, and something that almost nobody in my position, a woman making content about relationships, wants to address directly, because addressing it honestly requires admitting things that are uncomfortable. It requires looking at patterns that women have contributed to and not just patterns that have been done to women. And if you have been following this channel for any amount of time, you know that uncomfortable honesty is exactly what we do here. So here is what I am observing. Men are withdrawing, not dramatically, not with ultimatums or manifestos or public grievances, just quietly, steadily, and in numbers large enough that if you are paying attention, you cannot explain it away as individual quirks or personal failures. Something systemic is happening. Men are stepping back from dating, from pursuit, from the emotional labor of trying to be chosen, and a significant number of them are reporting that the withdrawal feels better than the participation ever did. And I think women need to hear that. Not to feel guilty about it, not to panic about it, but to actually understand it. Because understanding it is the only way any of this changes. Let me start with what this actually looks like on the ground, because I want you to have a concrete picture before we go deeper. The man who used to text first has stopped texting first. Not because he is playing games, not because he read some strategy in a book about making women chase, but because he sent the first message enough times and watched it go nowhere enough times that the cost-benefit calculation quietly shifted. He is not angry about it. He just stopped. The man who used to plan elaborate dates has stopped planning them, not out of laziness, but because he planned enough thoughtful evenings and received enough indifferent responses to understand that the effort was not landing the way he intended. The man who used to push through the difficult conversations, who used to show up and try harder when things got rocky, has stopped pushing, not because he stopped caring about connection, but because he pushed enough times in enough directions and found that pushing did not produce the outcome he was working toward. What replaced all of that effort is something that surprises people when they first encounter it. Silence, calm, a kind of interior quiet that men who have gone through this process describe not as emptiness, but as relief. And that word, relief, is the one I want to sit with for a moment, because it tells you something important about what the experience of modern dating has been like for a large number of men. Relief is what you feel when something painful stops. Relief is the absence of a pressure that was wearing you down. When men describe stepping back from the dating landscape and feeling relieved, they are telling you, in the clearest possible language, that participation was hurting them. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that produced obvious crisis, but in a slow, cumulative, grinding way that they often did not fully recognize until the pressure was gone and they could finally feel the contrast. I want to trace how this happened, because it did not happen suddenly, and it did not happen because men became weaker or more fragile or less capable of handling difficulty. It happened through a specific sequence of experiences that, repeated often enough, produced a rational and understandable adaptation. For a long time, men were operating inside a framework that told them love and partnership were things you earned through effort and demonstration. You showed your value. You proved your intentions. You worked to make yourself worthy of being chosen. And men, in enormous numbers, took that framework seriously. They worked on themselves. They built careers. They developed emotional awareness. They read the books and listened to the podcasts and went to the therapy and had the difficult conversations. They tried to become the version of themselves that the culture told them would finally be enough. And here is what they discovered. Enough kept moving. What was impressive became expected. What was appreciated became baseline. What was once recognized as genuine effort became, in the language that started circulating online and in dating conversations, the bare minimum. A man who was emotionally available, financially stable, physically healthy, and genuinely kind found himself being told that those qualities were not special. They were simply the starting requirements. The floor, not the ceiling. And the ceiling, it turned out, was always slightly higher than wherever he currently stood. I want to be honest with you about something here, because I think women often do not see this dynamic from the outside. the way men experience it from the inside. The constant escalation of standards, the reflexive framing of any male effort as insufficient, the cultural habit of describing decent behavior as the bare minimum, these things have a cumulative psychological effect that is genuinely damaging. Not because standards themselves are wrong, standards are not wrong. But there is a difference between having standards and operating from a posture of perpetual dissatisfaction. There is a difference between knowing what you need in a partner and approaching every interaction with the preemptive assumption that whoever is in front of you is probably not going to measure up. When a man walks into a date feeling like an applicant in a job interview, he is probably going to fail. That feeling does not come from nowhere. It comes from an accumulated experience of being evaluated rather than encountered, measured rather than met, auditioned rather than seen. And over time, that experience does something to a person. It does not necessarily make them bitter, though sometimes it does. More often, it makes them tired. And eventually, it makes them stop. Here is something else I want to name, because I think it is one of the more underexamined pieces of this. Comparison became a weapon in modern dating culture, and it was aimed almost exclusively in one direction. A man would offer his genuine self, his actual life, his real effort, and find it being measured not against reasonable expectations, but against a curated composite of every idealized man the algorithm had ever surfaced. Someone richer, someone taller, someone with better pictures and a more exciting life, and a kind of effortless confidence that reads well on a screen. The person actually present, with his real dimensions and his real limitations and his real humanity, could not compete with a composite that did not exist anywhere except in a feed designed to generate dissatisfaction. And women, I want to say this gently but directly, many of us participated in this, not maliciously, not deliberately. But we absorbed a cultural habit of comparison that made it nearly impossible to be fully present with whoever was actually in front of us. We were always half evaluating, half wondering, half keeping options open, because the culture told us that keeping options open was wisdom and that fully committing was risk. And the men on the other side of that half presence felt it. They could not name it precisely, but they felt it. And enough of them felt it enough times that they eventually concluded that the game was not worth playing. Now, here is where I want to challenge something, because I do not think this conversation is useful if it just becomes a long list of grievances. I want to actually examine what happened on both sides of this, because I think the full picture is more complicated than either side usually admits. Women did not invent the conditions that shaped modern dating culture. Women were also told a story about what they deserved and what they should demand, and what settling looked like and what refusing to settle looked like. We were sold an image of empowerment that was, in many cases, actually just a different kind of consumer behavior. Empowerment through rejection, empowerment through maintaining leverage, empowerment through never being the one who wanted more. And a lot of women followed that story sincerely, genuinely believing they were advocating for themselves, not understanding until much later what it was costing them and the people around them. But here is the thing about sincere mistakes. They still produce real consequences. And the real consequence of a generation of women being told that selectivity is always virtue and that male effort is always obligation is a generation of men who learned through direct experience that their sincerity was not a valued currency, that their kindness read as weakness, that their effort read as desperation, that showing genuine interest was somehow less attractive than strategic indifference. And men, like all humans, are adaptive. They adapted. Some of them adapted by becoming the emotionally unavailable, strategically indifferent men that the cultural dynamics seem to reward. Some of them adapted by pursuing connections outside the mainstream dating ecosystem, seeking women in different contexts or from different cultural backgrounds where the specific dynamics of modern Western dating were less dominant. And some of them, increasingly, adapted by simply stepping back, by deciding that the energy required to navigate all of this was better spent elsewhere, on work they found meaningful, on friendships that felt uncomplicated, on physical training that produced reliable results from reliable effort, on creative projects that rewarded investment proportionally, on the simple, underrated experience of interior quiet. And what they found in that withdrawal, and this is the part I think women genuinely need to hear, is that the withdrawal felt like restoration. It felt like recovering something they had not realized they were losing. Not just time or money or energy, though all of those were being spent in ways that produced poor returns, something deeper. A sense of their own worth that had been slowly eroded by sustained exposure to an environment that treated their effort as automatic and their presence as provisional. There is a concept I want to introduce here because I think it is useful, and I do not think it gets discussed honestly enough. It is rejection fatigue. And it is a real psychological phenomenon, not a weakness, not a failure of resilience, just a predictable human response to sustained negative feedback in a context that matters. When a person invests effort and receives rejection, they recalibrate. That is healthy. That is adaptive. But when a person invests effort and receives not just rejection, but the specific kind of rejection that communicates that the effort itself was somehow wrong or insufficient or vaguely embarrassing, when the message is not just no, but your approach to this is fundamentally lacking, something different happens. The person does not just recalibrate the specific effort. They begin to question the entire framework. They begin to ask whether trying in this direction is inherently futile. And if that question produces enough honest evidence in the direction of futility, eventually they stop trying in that direction altogether. This is what happened to a significant number of men in the modern dating landscape. They did not stop believing in connection. They stopped believing in a specific system that had, in their direct experience, consistently punished sincerity and rewarded performance. And the distinction matters. A man who has given up on love is in one kind of pain. A man who has given up on a rigged game while remaining fully capable of genuine love under different conditions is in a completely different situation. And I think most of the men who have quietly withdrawn fall into the second category, not the first. What does this mean in practice? It means that the absence you might be noticing, the men who are not texting, not pursuing, not planning, not emotionally available in the way they once were, is not primarily a story about damaged men. It is primarily a story about rational actors who updated their behavior based on consistent information. And the information they updated on came largely from experiences with women who were operating inside a cultural framework that neither side fully understood while they were inside it. Here is where I want to bring this back to something actionable, because I do not think content about relationship dynamics is useful if it just describes a problem and stops there. If you are a woman watching this and you are noticing that the men around you seem less engaged, less present, less willing to initiate and invest, I want you to consider the possibility that what you are observing is not a failure of those men. It is a response to an environment that women have significant power to shape. Not total power, not sole responsibility, but real, meaningful influence. The man in front of you is carrying the accumulated weight of every interaction he has had in this landscape before you, every conversation that went nowhere, every effort that was dismissed, every moment where he tried to be genuine and was evaluated instead of encountered. He is not bringing that history to you as a weapon. He is bringing it as a wound. And wounds do not heal through more of the same conditions that created them. What heals them is the experience of being somewhere different, of encountering someone who is actually present rather than perpetually evaluating, of having his effort received rather than measured, of being allowed to show up as a real and imperfect person rather than as a candidate in an ongoing audition. I want to say something here about what men actually need from a partner, and I want to say it plainly because I think it gets obscured by the noise around male stoicism and male strength and male emotional unavailability. Men are not complicated in the way people sometimes suggest. They do not need to be constantly praised or endlessly validated. They do not need to be protected from challenge or difficulty or high expectations. What they need, at the most fundamental level, is to feel like their presence matters. Not their income, not their status, not their performance, their actual presence, the felt sense that the person they are with is genuinely glad they are there. When that is present, men are extraordinary partners. They give in ways that are hard to quantify and even harder to replace. They protect, provide, support, show up, hold the structure of a shared life with a kind of quiet reliability that only becomes visible in its absence. When that felt sense of mattering is absent, when a man understands on some level that he is valued conditionally, instrumentally, provisionally, he does not make a speech about it. He does not issue demands or ultimatums. He goes quiet. He redirects his energy. He stops offering the things that were not being received, and eventually he steps back entirely. The silence that results is not punishment. That is another thing I want to be clear about. The men who have withdrawn from modern dating are not, for the most part, executing some deliberate strategy to make women feel the cost of their absence. They are simply following the most natural human instinct there is. The instinct to stop reaching towards something that consistently causes pain. And the cost of that silence is real. Not just for the men who are living in it, though the cost to them is real and worth acknowledging, but for women who want genuine partnership and are encountering men who have been hollowed out by the experience of trying and being found insufficient. And for the broader cultural possibility of men and women building lives together that are actually good, that are characterized by genuine mutual investment and real reciprocity, and the kind of sustained love that requires both people to bring their full and honest selves to the table. That possibility does not disappear because of what has happened, but it requires something that is harder than it sounds. It requires women to be honest, honestly honest, about the ways that the cultural story we absorbed and repeated and acted on created conditions that drove men away from sincerity, not as a guilt exercise, not as a reversal where women are now the problem and men are the victims, but as a real accounting, because real accounting is the only thing that produces real change. The men who have withdrawn have not given up on love. I want to say that again because I think it is the most important thing in everything I am saying today. They have given up on a particular version of romantic participation that was costing them more than it was returning. The capacity for love, for genuine investment, for the willingness to be fully present with another person. That capacity does not disappear because a man stops chasing. It goes quiet. It goes inward. It waits in the same place it has always been, and it responds to the same thing it has always responded to, not performance, not strategy, not the performance of neediness or the performance of indifference or any other calculated position designed to produce a particular reaction. It responds to genuine encounter, to the experience of being actually seen, without the filter of evaluation and comparison and the perpetual background calculation of whether something better might be available. Peace is what men have found in the withdrawal, and the only thing that will draw them back out of it, not manipulation, not social pressure, not shame, not the sudden cultural discovery that men have value after all, is the real experience of encountering someone who offers them what they found in solitude. Quiet, presence, the uncomplicated dignity of being enough. That is not a low standard, that is actually a very high one. Because offering genuine presence in a world built around distraction and comparison and the constant performance of desirability requires a level of self-awareness and intentionality that most people, men and women, have to work hard to develop. But it is the work that matters. It is the only work in relationships that has ever actually mattered. Everything else is noise. I am Anna. If this gave you something real to sit with, subscribe. I will see you in the next one.